The suburban neighborhood of Maplewood was the kind of place where everything looked picture perfect. Rows of neatly trimmed lawns, flower beds bursting with color, and streets so quiet you could hear birds chirping in the early mornings. It seemed like the ideal spot for starting fresh, especially for Sarah and her younger sister Lily. But beneath its polished surface, Maplewood had a secret. It wasn't as welcoming as it appeared. Sarah had recently moved there after years of living in bustling cities. She wanted a quieter life for herself and Lily, who was blind. Adjusting to this new environment wasn't easy, though. The Homeowners Association, HOA, ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, enforcing rules that seemed more suited to a military base than a residential community. No bright-colored clothes outside. Check. No parking on the street overnight. Got it. No stepping off the sidewalk onto anyone's lawn. Understood. To Sarah, these rules felt excessive, but she figured they were just quirks people tolerated to keep things nice. Lily, despite being visually impaired, loved exploring their new surroundings. With her trusty white cane, she enjoyed taking slow walks alongside Sarah, feeling the texture of tree bark or listening to the rustle of leaves. For Lily, every outing was an adventure, even if she couldn't see the world around her. Sarah admired her sister's resilience and tried hard to shield her from anything unpleasant. Unfortunately, not everyone shared her patience. Enter Karen, the unofficial leader of the HOA. Karen was infamous in Maplewood, not because she did anything extraordinary, but because she meddled in everyone's business. She patrolled the streets daily, clipboard in hand, ready to pounce on anyone daring to break a rule. Her perfectly styled hair and designer sunglasses gave her an air of superiority, while her sharp tongue struck fear into neighbors. Some joked that Karen treated the HOA handbook like it was the Constitution itself, interpreting its vague guidelines however she pleased. Karen's obsession with order made life difficult for many residents. She once reported a family for hanging laundry too high on their line, claiming it blocked sunlight. Another time, she fined a teenager for skateboarding on the pavement, even though he stayed clear of driveways. While most people rolled their eyes and paid their fines, others simmered with resentment. Still, no one dared challenge Karen directly. After all, crossing her meant risking endless scrutiny and nitpicking over every little detail of your property. For Sarah, dealing with Karen added another layer of stress to an already challenging transition. She knew how fragile Lily could be emotionally, and the last thing she needed was someone criticizing her or making her feel unwelcome. So far, they'd managed to stay under Karen's radar, sticking strictly to the rules and avoiding trouble. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that sooner or later, something would set Karen off. And when it did, she wasn't sure how she'd handle it. Little did Sarah know, her instincts were right. Trouble was brewing, and it would come knocking sooner than expected, in the form of a shove, a bush, and a moment that would change everything. It was one of those crisp, sunny afternoons that made Maplewood feel almost idyllic. The air carried the faint scent of blooming flowers, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. Sarah had promised Lily they'd take a walk together before dinner, a chance for both of them to stretch their legs and enjoy the calmness of the neighborhood. For Lily, these walks weren't just about exercise. They were moments of discovery. She loved trailing her fingers along fences, listening to birdsong, or feeling the texture of bark on tree trunks. To her, every outing felt like an exploration, even if she couldn't see the world around her. As they strolled down the sidewalk, Lily held tightly to her white cane, tapping it lightly against the ground in front of her. Sarah walked beside her, keeping a watchful eye while chatting about their plans for the weekend. They stayed well within the boundaries of the HOA's strict rules, careful not to step onto anyone's lawn or linger too long near flower beds. Despite Karen's reputation, Sarah hoped that following the guidelines would keep them out of trouble. But deep down, she couldn't shake the nagging sense that things might not go smoothly. Their path eventually led them past Karen's house, a pristine property with perfectly manicured hedges and rows of vibrant rose bushes lining the driveway. It was hard not to admire the effort Karen put into maintaining her yard, though Sarah suspected much of it stemmed from her need for control rather than genuine love for gardening. As they approached, Karen emerged from her porch, squinting at them through oversized sunglasses. Her lips curled into a frown as she zeroed in on Lily's cane, which occasionally swung slightly wide during her movements. "Hey, watch where you're going," Karen barked, striding toward them with surprising speed for someone wearing heels. Startled, Sarah stopped in her tracks and gently guided Lily to pause as well. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked politely, trying to diffuse the situation before it escalated. Karen jabbed a finger toward the roses. "Your sister's stick is ruining my bushes. Look at this. Look what she's doing." She pointed dramatically at a spot where Lily's cane had brushed against one of the petals, leaving no visible damage whatsoever. Still, Karen acted as if the entire garden had been destroyed. "These are prize-winning roses. Do you have any idea how much time and money I've invested in them?" Sarah blinked, taken aback by the accusation. "I'm sorry," she said firmly but calmly. "We're staying on the sidewalk, and there's plenty of space between us and your plants. If her cane touched anything, it was completely accidental." But Karen wasn't interested in apologies. Her face reddened with anger, and she stepped closer, ignoring the growing distance between herself and reason. "Accidental? That's not good enough," she snapped. Without warning, she lunged forward, shoving Lily with surprising force. The sudden movement caught everyone off guard. Lily stumbled backward, arms flailing, and landed awkwardly in a nearby bush. Twigs crackled under her weight, and leaves clung to her hair and clothes. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Sarah stood rooted to the spot, her heart pounding as she watched her blind sister struggle to untangle herself from the shrubbery. Tears welled up in Lily's eyes, not just from the fall, but from the shock and humiliation of being pushed so violently without understanding why. A few neighbors peeked out from behind curtains or paused mid-walk, unsure whether to intervene. No one said a word, but the tension in the air was palpable. Karen, meanwhile, crossed her arms smugly, as if she'd proven some sort of point. "That'll teach you to respect other people's property," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for Sarah to hear. But her victory was short-lived. Unbeknownst to her, Sarah wasn't alone, and help was already on its way. Just as Karen stood there, arms crossed, and a self-satisfied smirk plastered across her face, the sound of heavy boots striking pavement echoed down the street. Heads turned, including Karen's, as a figure approached with commanding strides. It was Sarah, but not the Sarah anyone had seen before. Gone was the casual demeanor of a protective older sister. In her place stood someone who radiated authority and strength. Clad in full army gear, complete with combat boots, camouflage fatigues, and dog tags bouncing lightly against her chest, she looked every bit like the soldier she was. Sarah had been running errands just a block away when she heard Lily's cry. Dropping everything, she sprinted back toward the sound, adrenaline coursing through her veins. By the time she reached the scene, her military training kicked in automatically. Her posture was rigid, her movements deliberate, and her eyes locked onto Karen with laser focus. The transformation was so striking that even Karen, usually unshakable in her superiority, took an involuntary step backward. "Step away from my sister," Sarah said, her voice low and steady, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to giving orders. There was no room for argument in her tone, just pure, unyielding resolve. Neighbors who had been watching from their windows or lingering on the sidewalk felt the shift in energy immediately. This wasn't just a concerned sibling anymore. This was a trained professional ready to take charge. Without waiting for Karen's response, Sarah knelt beside Lily, gently helping her out of the bush. She brushed leaves and twigs from her sister's hair and clothes, speaking softly to reassure her. "It's okay, Lil. I've got you." Though her words were calm, her body language remained tense, her gaze never straying far from Karen. Once Lily was steady on her feet again, Sarah stood up, positioning herself firmly between her sister and the woman who had caused the harm. Karen, clearly flustered by the sudden change in dynamics, tried to regain control of the situation. "Oh, come on. You can't just show up here dressed like asterisk that asterisk," she sputtered, gesturing vaguely at Sarah's uniform. Her attempt at mockery fell flat, though, as her voice wavered under the weight of Sarah's piercing stare. For the first time in years, Karen found herself at a loss for words. The crowd of onlookers grew bolder now that Sarah had arrived. Whispers rippled through the group as they exchanged knowing glances. One neighbor muttered, "Finally, someone's standing up to her." Another nodded approvingly, adding, "About time Karen got what's coming to her." Even those too timid to speak aloud seemed to straighten slightly, emboldened by Sarah's presence. Sarah ignored the murmurs, keeping her attention fixed on Karen. Slowly, she took a step forward, closing the gap between them. Her height combined with her imposing stance made Karen shrink visibly, her earlier bravado crumbling. "Let's get one thing clear," Sarah began, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "What you did to my sister, shoving her, humiliating her, is unacceptable. And if you think your precious HOA rules give you the right to treat people this way, then you're sorely mistaken." Her words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but quickly closed it again, unable to find a rebuttal. Instead, she shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the growing audience. For once, she wasn't the center of attention in the way she preferred. People weren't nodding along with her complaints or cowering under her glare. They were watching her squirm and enjoying every second of it. Sarah didn't stop there. With the precision of someone used to commanding respect, she continued, "I'll deal with you properly in a moment. But first, let's make sure my sister is okay." Turning her back on Karen entirely, she guided Lily to a nearby bench, checking her over for injuries. Every movement was deliberate, every action calculated to send a message. Karen's behavior wouldn't go unanswered. And deep down, everyone knew this was only the beginning. Once Lily was seated safely on the bench, Sarah turned her full attention back to Karen. Her expression hadn't softened. If anything, it had grown even more resolute. The crowd of neighbors lingered nearby, their curiosity outweighing any fear of Karen's usual wrath. No one spoke, but the air buzzed with anticipation. Everyone could sense that this confrontation wasn't going to end quietly. Karen, clearly rattled by Sarah's commanding presence and the growing audience, tried to regain some semblance of control. "Look," she began, her voice wavering slightly, "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was just protecting my property. Those roses are expensive, you know. If people can't follow basic rules—" "Stop right there," Sarah interrupted, her tone sharp enough to silence Karen mid-sentence. She took a step closer, her posture unwavering. "Let's break this down, shall we?" she said, her voice steady and measured, like a teacher explaining something simple to a stubborn student. "First, my sister and I were walking on the sidewalk, the exact place pedestrians are supposed to be. Second, her cane barely grazed your bush. There's no damage. And third," she paused, letting her words hang in the air for emphasis, "even if her cane asterisk had asterisk touched your precious flowers, shoving a blind person into a bush is not protecting property. It's assault. Plain and simple." The word assault landed like a thunderclap. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement while others whispered about calling the police. Karen's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger, it was hard to tell. She opened her mouth to argue, but Sarah cut her off again before she could speak. "You don't get to hide behind HOA rules when you cross a line," Sarah continued, her voice rising just enough to command everyone's attention. "Rules exist to keep order, not to justify cruelty. What you did today has nothing to do with maintaining standards. It's about power. You wanted to intimidate us because you thought you could get away with it." Karen stammered, clutching at straws. But she shouldn't have been so close to my yard in the first place, she protested weakly, pointing toward the bush where Lily had fallen. She invaded my space. Sarah raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Invaded? Really? Let me remind you, Karen, public sidewalks are exactly that. Public. They belong to everyone, including my sister. Unless you've somehow privatized the entire neighborhood without telling us, she had every right to be there. A few chuckles escaped from the crowd, breaking the tension momentarily. Even Lily managed a small smile despite her earlier ordeal. Realizing her arguments weren't gaining traction, Karen shifted tactics. Fine, she snapped, folding her arms defensively. Maybe I overreacted, okay. Accidents happen. Why don't we just move on? No, Sarah replied firmly, her gaze locking onto Karen's. We're not moving on. Not this time. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, tapping the screen to activate its camera. Holding it up, she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "For the record, I'm documenting what happened here today. If necessary, I'll file a formal complaint. And trust me, I know how to make sure it sticks." Her statement sent shockwaves through the crowd. Neighbors exchanged nervous glances, realizing this wasn't just idle talk. Sarah wasn't bluffing. Her military background gave her credibility, and her calm demeanor made it clear she meant business. Karen, on the other hand, looked like a cornered animal. For years, she bullied her way through the neighborhood, relying on intimidation and petty threats to maintain her dominance. But now, faced with someone who refused to back down, she had nowhere left to run. As Sarah recorded the incident, detailing everything from Karen's aggressive behavior to the lack of actual damage to her property, the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just another squabble over HOA regulations. It was a reckoning. And for the first time in a long time, Karen found herself on the losing side. The moment Sarah hit stop on her phone, the atmosphere shifted. Karen's shoulders slumped as if she'd been deflated, her earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of accountability. She glanced around at the neighbors, hoping for support, or at least indifference, but found none. Instead, the crowd stared back at her with expressions ranging from disapproval to outright disgust. It was clear that this incident had struck a nerve, not just with Sarah and Lily, but with everyone who had silently endured Karen's bullying for years. "Fine," Karen muttered, attempting one last desperate attempt at saving face. "I'll apologize. Okay. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Her voice lacked conviction, and her apology sounded more like an obligation than genuine remorse. She turned toward Lily, forcing a half-hearted smile. "Sorry about, the bush thing." But Sarah wasn't about to let her off that easily. Stepping forward, she said firmly, "An apology isn't enough, not this time. You've spent years intimidating people in this neighborhood, using the HOA rules as an excuse to wield power over others. Today, you crossed a line by physically assaulting my sister. That's not something you can brush aside with a weak sorry." Her words resonated deeply with the onlookers. One neighbor, a middle-aged man named Tom, stepped forward hesitantly. He cleared his throat before speaking. "She's right, Karen. This has gone on long enough. Remember when you fined me $50 because my kid left his bike on the sidewalk for 10 minutes? Or when you made Mrs. Pottle repaint her mailbox because it was too colorful?" His voice grew stronger as he continued. "We've all put up with your nonsense because we didn't want trouble, but what happened today is different. You hurt someone who couldn't even defend themselves." Others began chiming in, emboldened by Tom's courage. A young mother holding her toddler added, "And don't forget how you yelled at Mrs. Rodriguez for hanging Christmas lights too early. Meanwhile, your decorations go up in October every year." Another neighbor shouted, "Yeah, and what about the time you called animal control on Mr. Harris because his cat wandered into your yard? The poor guy almost lost his pet." Each accusation seemed to chip away at Karen's carefully constructed facade. Her cheeks burned red, and she fidgeted uncomfortably, glancing around as if searching for an escape route. But there was no way out now. The floodgates had opened, and years of pent-up frustration came pouring out. Sarah watched silently as the community finally stood up to Karen. Though she hadn't orchestrated this uprising, she felt a sense of satisfaction knowing her actions had sparked it. When the murmurs died down, she addressed the group directly. "This isn't just about today or about my sister," she said, her tone calm but firm. "It's about creating a neighborhood where kindness and respect matter more than rigid rules. If we let behavior like this slide, it sends a message that cruelty is acceptable as long as you hide behind some policy." Her words struck a chord with everyone present. Neighbors exchanged nods and quiet agreements, realizing they had the power to change things. Someone suggested calling an emergency HOA meeting to address Karen's conduct officially, and several others quickly volunteered to help organize it. By the time the crowd dispersed, plans were already underway to hold Karen accountable and to push for reforms within the association itself. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, Karen retreated to her house, defeated and humiliated. For the first time, she was truly alone, stripped of the authority she clung to so fiercely. Meanwhile, Sarah returned to Lily, who sat quietly on the bench, listening to the commotion with a mix of awe and relief. "Did you hear all that?" Sarah asked gently, sitting beside her sister. Lily nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah, feels like people are finally standing up for what's right." Sarah wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "They are. And we're going to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Not to you, not to anyone." As they sat together, watching the neighborhood settle into an unfamiliar yet hopeful calm, it was clear that Maplewood was ready for a new chapter, one defined not by fear, but by unity and justice. The next evening, the community center buzzed with an energy it hadn't seen in years. Residents filed into the room, some carrying notebooks, others whispering nervously to their neighbors. The emergency HOA meeting had drawn a record turnout. Everyone wanted to be part of whatever came next. At the front of the room sat Sarah and Lily, side by side, looking calm but resolute. Word had spread quickly about how Sarah had confronted Karen, and many people now saw her as the catalyst for change they'd been waiting for. Karen arrived late, slipping into the back corner of the room like a shadow trying to avoid notice. Gone was her usual air of superiority. Instead, she looked small and uneasy, clutching her purse tightly, as if it might shield her from the storm brewing around her. The board members called the meeting to order, but it was clear early on that this wasn't going to be a typical discussion about paint colors or mailbox heights. This was personal, and everyone knew it. One by one, residents stood up to share their grievances. Some recounted petty fines they'd received for minor infractions, while others spoke of feeling belittled or bullied by Karen's relentless enforcement of rules. Mrs. Rodriguez tearfully described how Karen's call to animal control nearly cost her elderly neighbor his beloved cat, a companion that brought him comfort after losing his wife. A teenager recounted being publicly shamed for skateboarding on the sidewalk, even though he stayed far from driveways. Each story added weight to the growing case against Karen, painting a picture of someone who used power not to improve the neighborhood, but to dominate it. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, the room fell silent. She stood slowly, her military training evident in her poised demeanor. "What happened to my sister yesterday wasn't just an isolated incident," she began, her voice steady and clear. "It was the result of years of unchecked behavior. Rules are important. They help maintain order and keep communities safe. But when those rules become tools for cruelty, they lose their purpose." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "We need accountability here. Not just for what happened to Lily, but for every time someone in this room felt afraid to speak up because they didn't want to deal with Karen's retaliation. We deserve better than that. Maplewood deserves better." Her speech earned a round of applause, followed by more heartfelt testimonies from others emboldened by her courage. By the end of the meeting, the board members unanimously agreed to strip Karen of her leadership role within the HOA. They also vowed to review existing policies, ensuring they prioritized fairness and compassion over nitpicking enforcement. For the first time in years, residents left the community center feeling hopeful about the future. In the days that followed, subtle changes began to take root. Neighbors who had once avoided each other started greeting one another warmly. Someone organized a weekend cleanup event, and volunteers turned out in droves to beautify shared spaces. Even Karen's prized roses seemed less intimidating now that she no longer patrolled the streets with her clipboard. For Lily, healing came gradually. Though the physical bruises from the bush faded quickly, the emotional scars took longer to mend. Sarah spent extra time reassuring her sister, reminding her that she was loved and valued, not just by family, but by the entire community. Together, they resumed their walks, no longer worried about running afoul of unreasonable rules or hostile neighbors. Instead, they were greeted with smiles and waves. Proof that Maplewood was becoming the kind of place where kindness mattered most. As life settled into its new rhythm, Sarah reflected on everything that had transpired. Standing up to Karen hadn't been easy, but it was necessary, not just for Lily's sake, but for everyone's. Sometimes, all it took was one person refusing to stay silent to spark real change. And in doing so, Sarah had given her neighborhood something far more valuable than perfectly trimmed lawns: hope. Weeks turned into months, and Maplewood transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The once oppressive grip of Karen's rule had loosened, replaced by a spirit of cooperation and kindness that seemed to seep into every corner of the neighborhood. Residents who had previously kept to themselves now gathered regularly for block parties, book clubs, and weekend gardening sessions. Even Karen's house, which had always felt like a fortress with its perfectly manicured hedges, began to soften, literally. Her roses still bloomed beautifully, but she no longer policed passersby or glared at children playing nearby. Sarah became an unofficial leader in the community, not because she sought the role, but because people naturally gravitated toward her strength and fairness. When disputes arose over noise levels or parking spots, neighbors turned to her for advice, knowing she would handle things diplomatically. She often joked that her military training hadn't prepared her for mediating arguments about lawnmowers, but she approached each situation with the same level-headedness that had earned everyone's respect. Lily, too, found joy in the renewed sense of belonging. The walks she took with Sarah were filled with laughter and curiosity as neighbors greeted her warmly. One elderly woman even taught her how to identify different flowers by touch, describing their shapes and scents in vivid detail. Another neighbor gifted Lily a small potted plant, saying, "This one's tough, just like you." It sat proudly on their windowsill, a symbol of resilience and new beginnings. Karen, meanwhile, faded into the background. Stripped of her authority, she retreated into herself, spending most days indoors. Some residents pitied her, realizing that her behavior had likely stemmed from insecurity rather than malice. Others simply moved on, focusing instead on building a better future for the neighborhood. Occasionally, someone would spot her tending to her roses, and though she rarely smiled, there was a quiet humility in her demeanor that hadn't been there before. The HOA underwent significant reforms under new leadership. Rules were rewritten to prioritize practicality and inclusivity over perfectionism. Bright-colored mailboxes allowed. Kids riding bikes on sidewalks encouraged. Pets wandering briefly into yards. No calls to animal control unless absolutely necessary. These changes might have seemed minor, but they made a world of difference, fostering a culture where people felt seen and valued rather than judged. As autumn arrived, painting the trees with shades of gold and crimson, the neighborhood held its first annual harvest festival. Tables lined the streets, laden with homemade pies, pumpkin decorations, and crafts made by local kids. A live band played cheerful tunes while families mingled, sharing stories and laughter. At the center of it all stood Sarah and Lily, surrounded by friends old and new. Someone handed Lily a carved pumpkin, guiding her fingers over its smooth surface and jagged edges. "This is yours," they said. "Feel free to make it as unique as you are." For Sarah, the festival marked a turning point, not just for Maplewood, but for herself. She'd returned home seeking peace and stability, only to find herself at the heart of a movement for change. Though she never imagined becoming a community advocate, she realized that standing up for what was right wasn't just about protecting her family. It was about creating a world where everyone could thrive. That night, as fireworks lit up the sky in bursts of color, Sarah wrapped an arm around Lily, pulling her close. "What do you think, Lil?" she asked softly. "Do you feel safe here now?" Lily nodded, her face glowing with happiness. "Yeah, I think we both do." In that moment, surrounded by warmth and light, Sarah knew they had finally found their place, not just in Maplewood, but in each other's hearts. Life wasn't perfect, and challenges would surely come again. But together, they had proven that love, courage, and a little bit of army-grade determination could overcome even the toughest obstacles. And sometimes, all it took was one bold act to remind people of what truly mattered: kindness, connection, and the power of standing up for what's right.